In the early 2000s, a forgotten Nazi castle suddenly returned to public attention, not through archives, not through court documents, but through rumors, online forums, television documentaries, and late-night history channels began repeating the same story. That deep inside Wewelsburg Castle, Heinrich Himmler had tried to build something more than a headquarters. That the SS had a temple, a place of rituals, a place of power. Some called it Himmler's Temple of Doom. Others claimed ancient symbols were hidden in its walls, that an artifact of unknown origin had once been kept there, that the castle was chosen not by chance, but because of forces older than Germany itself. By the early 2000s, the story had everything a modern myth needs: a Nazi secret, an occult symbol, and the promise of a truth they don't want you to know. But myths rarely begin where people think they do. Because before Wewelsburg became a temple in popular imagination, it was something far more dangerous. It was a place where belief was manufactured. And to understand whether this castle was ever a temple of doom, we first need to understand how myths are built, not in ancient times, but in the 20th century. Before it became a symbol, before it attracted myths, rumors, and late-night documentaries, Wewelsburg Castle was something deeply unremarkable. It stood quietly in the Westphalian countryside, far from imperial capitals and ancient pilgrimage routes. Built in the early 17th century, it was never meant to be eternal, sacred, or powerful. It was a Renaissance-era castle commissioned by a regional prince-bishop, one of many administrative residences scattered across the Holy Roman Empire. Its purpose was practical, defensive to a degree, representational to a degree, but never mystical. There were no ancient cults tied to the land beneath it, no pagan sanctuaries buried in its foundations, no medieval legends that set it apart from hundreds of other German castles. For centuries, Wewelsburg existed in near anonymity. It changed hands. It was damaged and repaired. It served as a residence, a prison, a storage site. At various points, it was partially abandoned. At others, it was simply inconvenient, too expensive to maintain, too remote to matter. This is an uncomfortable starting point for a story that would later be wrapped in secrecy and symbolism. But it is also the most important one, because myths do not attach themselves to powerful places. They attach themselves to empty ones. By the late 19th century, Wewelsburg was already sliding into obscurity. Germany was industrializing. Cities were expanding. Railroads were redrawing the map of relevance. Castles like Wewelsburg, isolated and functionally obsolete, became relics, objects of mild local pride at best, financial burdens at worst. There was nothing inevitable about what came next. The castle was not discovered. It was selected. When the National Socialists came to power in 1933, they inherited a country saturated with history, but starved for meaning. Germany was not lacking monuments. It was lacking a unifying myth that could transform defeat, humiliation, and economic collapse into destiny. And this is where Wewelsburg becomes useful, not because of what it was, but because of what it was not. It had no fixed narrative, no entrenched religious identity, no competing legend that needed to be erased. It was, in ideological terms, a blank canvas. The Nazis did not stumble upon Wewelsburg while chasing ancient secrets. They were not led there by archaeology or folklore. There is no record of early SS documents describing the site as sacred, cursed, or special in any supernatural sense. What they saw instead was isolation. Wewelsburg sat away from major cities, far from prying eyes, surrounded by countryside that could be controlled, reshaped, and repurposed. It was architecturally distinctive, triangular in layout, but not so famous that it carried cultural baggage. It could be transformed without resistance, reinterpreted without debate. This mattered more than any imagined ley line. The castle's very ordinariness was its strength. It allowed ideology to move in without friction. In the early years of Nazi rule, countless historic sites were evaluated for potential reuse. Some were turned into museums, others into training centers or administrative offices. Most were rejected as impractical or symbolically compromised. Wewelsburg was different, not because it whispered of ancient gods, but because it said almost nothing at all. By the mid-1930s, the castle had been leased and then effectively taken over by the SS. Renovation plans followed quickly. Not repairs in the conventional sense, but transformations. Spaces were redesigned. New halls were planned. The castle was no longer treated as a historic artifact. It was treated as raw material. And raw material, in the hands of an ideological regime, is never neutral. One of the most persistent myths surrounding Wewelsburg suggests that the Nazis believed they were reclaiming a lost pagan center, reviving a forgotten sanctuary. This idea is seductive. It flatters the imagination. It gives the site a prehistory worthy of its later reputation. But it collapses under scrutiny. German scholars, both before and after the war, found no evidence of pre-Christian religious significance tied specifically to Wewelsburg. No Roman temples, no Germanic holy sites, no archaeological layers suggesting ritual use beyond the ordinary rhythms of rural life. The Nazis were many things. Careless with human life, ruthless with truth. But when it came to symbolism, they were not improvisers. They were planners. If Wewelsburg had possessed a genuine ancient pedigree, it would have been documented, exploited, and broadcast. Instead, its mythology had to be constructed almost from scratch. This is the first major crack in the Temple of Doom narrative. Temples inherit sanctity. Wewelsburg was assigned one, and that assignment did not come from the past. It came from power. The castle's architecture was reinterpreted to fit a new story. Its triangular form, once a practical design choice, was imbued with symbolic meaning. Rooms were renamed, axes were aligned, empty halls were reimagined as ceremonial spaces. None of this required belief in the supernatural. It required belief in hierarchy. What mattered was not whether Wewelsburg connected to ancient forces, but whether it could discipline modern men, whether it could impress, intimidate, and transform those who passed through it. The SS leadership understood something fundamental about human psychology. Authority becomes more powerful when it feels timeless. A uniform can command obedience. A ritual can deepen it. But a place, especially one framed as ancient and secret, can sanctify it. This is where Wewelsburg begins to change, not physically, but conceptually. It stops being a castle with a history and becomes a stage for ideology, a controlled environment in which myth could be rehearsed, repeated, and normalized, not through spectacle, but through atmosphere, silence, stone, repetition. The myth that later emerged, of a Nazi temple, a center of dark rituals, a place of occult convergence, mistakes effect for cause. The atmosphere did not exist because the Nazis believed in ancient magic. The belief came because the atmosphere worked. By the late 1930s, the transformation was underway. But crucially, it was incomplete. Wewelsburg was never finished. Many of the grand plans remained on paper. Others were interrupted by war, logistics, and eventually collapse. This incompleteness would later become fertile ground for speculation. Unfinished projects invite imagination. Empty spaces invite stories. After the war, as Germany reckoned with the visible ruins of the Third Reich, Wewelsburg occupied a strange position. It had not been bombed into oblivion like Berlin. It had not been immortalized like Nuremberg. It remained standing, damaged, altered, but intact enough to provoke questions. Why here? Why this castle? What were they planning? These questions, unanswered by visible ruins or completed rituals, lingered. And into that silence, myth poured in. But before we follow those myths, one thing must be clear. Wewelsburg did not begin as a place of doom. It did not inherit darkness from antiquity. It did not conceal ancient secrets waiting to be unlocked. It became dangerous only when it was chosen. Chosen by a regime that understood that belief does not need truth to function, only structure, repetition, and authority. And that is what turns an ordinary castle into something far more unsettling than a temple. It turns it into a machine. If Wewelsburg was the stage, then the script was written by one man, not Adolf Hitler. The Führer understood spectacle, crowds, and emotion. He ruled through visibility, through mass rallies, banners, and noise. His power was public, theatrical, almost performative. But the vision that transformed Wewelsburg came from someone else, from Heinrich Himmler. Himmler did not look like a man destined to shape the inner mythology of the Third Reich. He was not charismatic. He was not a gifted speaker. He lacked the theatrical instincts of Hitler and the brutal pragmatism of men like Goering. What Himmler possessed instead was patience, and a belief that power, to last, must feel sacred. From the earliest days of the SS, Himmler imagined it not merely as an armed formation, but as something closer to an order, a closed community, an elite bound, not just by loyalty to the state, but by a shared worldview that transcended politics. This distinction mattered. Armies fight wars, orders endure. In Himmler's thinking, the SS was not meant to win battles alone. It was meant to outlive the war itself, to become the moral and biological core of a future German world. To achieve this, obedience was not enough. Obedience can be enforced. Faith cannot. Himmler understood that Christianity, despite centuries of influence in Germany, was incompatible with the racial ideology of National Socialism. Its emphasis on universalism, humility, and moral equality stood in direct opposition to a system built on hierarchy, blood, and exclusion. But abolishing religion outright was impossible, so Himmler sought to replace it, not with atheism, but with something more subtle, a belief system that felt ancient, exclusive, and inevitable. One that framed SS men, not as soldiers following orders, but as chosen participants in a historical mission. This is where myth enters, not as superstition, but as structure. Himmler's obsession was not with magic spells or supernatural forces. It was with legitimacy, with creating the impression that the SS did not merely serve Germany, but embodied its destiny. To do this, he turned to history, not as a record of facts, but as raw material. The past could be edited, reframed, purified. Germanic history was stripped of complexity and repackaged as a racial saga. Defeats became betrayals. Diversity became contamination. Violence became renewal. Within this worldview, symbols mattered more than explanations. A ritual does not need to be understood to be effective. It only needs to be repeated. Himmler introduced ceremonial practices into the SS that mimicked religious traditions while rejecting their origins. Birthdays replaced Christian holidays. Marriage ceremonies were redesigned to emphasize bloodlines over vows. Death was reframed not as an ending, but as a sacrifice to the collective future. None of this required belief in gods. It required belief in belonging. Wewelsburg fit perfectly into this vision, not because it radiated mystical energy, but because it could be controlled completely. Unlike churches, it had no living congregation. Unlike ancient temples, it carried no inherited doctrine. It could be reshaped without resistance. Within its walls, Himmler imagined a symbolic center for the SS, a place where ideology could be reinforced away from the chaos of the outside world, a place of reflection, instruction, and internal hierarchy. Crucially, Wewelsburg was never intended to be open to the public. This was not a propaganda site for the masses. It was inward-facing, reserved for a narrow elite. Secrecy was not a side effect. It was the point. By restricting access, Himmler amplified meaning. What is hidden feels important. What is restricted feels powerful. This is why later myths about forbidden rituals and dark ceremonies found such fertile ground. The secrecy was real. The interpretation came later. Within the SS, rank alone did not guarantee inclusion. Participation in the inner symbolic world of the order had to be earned. Invitations mattered. Proximity mattered. Architecture became part of this hierarchy. Spaces were designed to feel austere, repetitive, and detached from everyday life. There was nothing warm or welcoming about the planned interiors. They were meant to inspire discipline, silence, and focus. This was not mysticism. It was conditioning. Himmler believed that men shaped by such environments would internalize authority more deeply. That ideology, when reinforced by place and ritual, would become instinct. The goal was not ecstasy. It was permanence. One of the most persistent misconceptions about Himmler's project is the idea that he sought ancient power, some hidden force that could be unlocked through symbols or artifacts. There is no evidence of this. What evidence does show is a man obsessed with continuity, with creating a lineage where none existed, with binding the SS to a fabricated past so convincingly that it would feel inherited rather than imposed. In this sense, Himmler was less a mystic than a myth engineer. He did not ask, "What did our ancestors believe?" He asked, "What do we need them to have believed?" Wewelsburg became the physical answer to that question. Plans drawn up for the castle envisioned it not as a functioning headquarters, but as a symbolic anchor, a place that represented the SS as timeless, disciplined, and separate from ordinary society. Importantly, these plans were never fully realized. The war intervened. Resources were diverted. Priorities shifted. What remained was a partially transformed structure, heavy with intention, light on completion. This incompleteness would later fuel speculation. Unfinished projects invite imagination. Silence invites projection. But during the years it functioned under SS control, Wewelsburg was not a center of occult practice. It was a center of ideological reinforcement, a place where the SS rehearsed its self-image. Men who passed through it were not initiated into secret knowledge. They were reminded, subtly, repeatedly, of who they were supposed to be, chosen, separate, superior. This is what made the site dangerous, not because it summoned demons, but because it normalized dehumanization. When violence is framed as duty, and duty is framed as destiny, cruelty becomes administrative. Murder becomes procedural. Himmler understood this progression intuitively. He did not need ancient gods to justify mass killing. He needed men who believed they were instruments of history. Wewelsburg was designed to help produce such men. By the time the war turned against Germany, the project had already served its purpose. The SS did not need a completed temple to function. The myth had been internalized. In 1945, as defeat became inevitable, parts of the castle were deliberately destroyed, not in a ritual act, but in a practical one, to prevent its use by the enemy. There was no final ceremony, no apocalyptic ending, just demolition. This mundane conclusion is often overlooked, but it matters. True temples leave behind traditions. True religions leave behind texts. Wewelsburg left behind fragments. And fragments are perfect material for myth. After the war, as the horrors of the SS were exposed, attention turned to understanding how such an organization could exist at all, how ordinary men could commit extraordinary crimes. Wewelsburg offered a tempting answer, a place, a symbol, a supposed center of darkness. It was easier to imagine a temple of doom than to accept a more disturbing truth, that no magic was needed, only structure, belief, and obedience reinforced by myth. Himmler's vision did not fail because it was irrational. It failed because the regime that sustained it collapsed. The ideas, however, proved more resilient. And as long as Wewelsburg stood, silent, unfinished, and heavy with implication, it remained a canvas onto which new fears and fantasies could be projected. The myth did not die with its creator. It simply changed hands. Power does not need to announce itself to be effective. It only needs to be felt. When the SS took control of Wewelsburg Castle, the transformation that followed was not primarily decorative. It was architectural, spatial, psychological. The goal was not to create beauty. It was to create alignment. Himmler understood something that many dictators intuit, but few articulate. Ideology becomes stronger when it is embedded in routine, space, and movement. When belief is reinforced not by argument, but by environment. Wewelsburg was redesigned to do precisely that. Unlike Nazi rally grounds or monumental government buildings, the castle was never meant to impress crowds. Its audience was small and carefully selected. Senior SS officers, ideological loyalists, men already inside the system. This was not a place to persuade outsiders. It was a place to consolidate insiders. The architectural plans developed for Wewelsburg reveal an obsession with order and repetition. Corridors were meant to guide movement deliberately. Rooms were planned not for comfort, but for function. There was little ornamentation, little warmth. Stone dominated. Angles mattered. Silence was intentional. The most important changes were concentrated in the northern part of the complex. Not because of ancient tradition, but because of symbolism imposed from above. In many cultures, north carries connotations of permanence, cold, and endurance. For Himmler, these associations aligned neatly with his vision of the SS. The North Tower became the conceptual heart of the project. It is crucial to understand what this tower was, and what it was not. It was not a temple in the religious sense. It had no altar, no priesthood, no formal liturgy. What it offered instead was atmosphere. Inside, the space was circular, enclosed, intentionally removed from the outside world. The design discouraged casual movement and casual thought. One did not pass through the room. One entered it. This distinction matters. Spaces designed for transit encourage distraction. Spaces designed for pause encourage focus. Everything about the tower suggested seriousness without explanation, meaning without clarity. It did not tell its visitors what to believe. It told them that belief was expected. This is how modern power often operates. There is no need to explain ideology to those already inside the system. There is only a need to remind them that they are part of something larger, older, and unquestionable. The architecture did this silently. What later generations would interpret as ominous or mystical was, at the time, primarily disciplinary. The space demanded stillness. It discouraged conversation. It encouraged contemplation, but not of moral questions. Contemplation of role. Who am I within this structure? Where do I stand in the hierarchy? What is expected of me? These are not spiritual questions. They are organizational ones. Throughout the castle, similar principles were applied. Living quarters were sparse. Communal spaces were designed to reinforce rank. There was a deliberate absence of personal comfort. Individuality was not encouraged. The message was subtle but relentless. You are here to serve, not to exist. This approach mirrored broader SS culture. The emphasis on uniformity, ritualized behavior, and emotional restraint was not accidental. It was a system designed to suppress doubt and to amplify obedience. Wewelsburg simply concentrated that system into physical form. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the site is the assumption that architecture was meant to channel supernatural power. In reality, it was meant to channel human behavior. Stone does not summon spirits, but it can shape conduct. The castle's isolation amplified this effect. Removed from cities, from families, From ordinary social life, those who visited Wewelsburg were temporarily immersed in a closed world, a world where the SS vision appeared self-contained and self-justifying. There were no alternative narratives inside the walls, no dissenting voices, no reminders of civilian life. This isolation was essential. Totalitarian systems thrive on environments where contradiction is absent, where ideology appears natural because nothing challenges it. Wewelsburg was not unique in this respect. Monasteries, military academies, and secret societies have long used similar principles. What made the SS project distinctive was its purpose. This was not preparation for defense or spiritual growth. It was preparation for domination. The castle functioned as a symbolic workshop where the SS refined its self-image. Here, officers were reminded, through space rather than speech, that they were not ordinary Germans. They were meant to see themselves as the custodians of a future order. This sense of being chosen was reinforced constantly, but never explicitly explained. Explanation invites scrutiny. Atmosphere does not. This is why later descriptions of Wewelsburg often struggle to articulate what exactly happened there. There were no dramatic ceremonies witnessed by crowds, no public records of occult rites, no surviving manuals of secret practices. What existed instead was repetition. Men returning to the castle encountered the same spaces, the same silence, the same symbolic cues. Over time, these cues ceased to be noticed consciously. They became background assumptions. And assumptions, once internalized, are difficult to dislodge. It is also important to address the labor that made this transformation possible. The renovations at Wewelsburg relied heavily on forced labor. Prisoners from nearby concentration camps were used to carry out construction, repairs, and expansion work. Their suffering is often relegated to footnotes in discussions of the castle's symbolism. This omission is itself revealing. Myths focus upward, on leaders, symbols, imagined rituals. Reality flows downward, to those whose lives were consumed, to build the stage on which ideology performed itself. The castle's imposing silence was built on noise, on commands shouted, on bodies pushed beyond exhaustion, on lives deemed expendable. This contradiction lies at the heart of the Wewelsburg myth. The SS framed the site as a place of purity and destiny. The reality was exploitation and violence. Yet the architecture absorbed these contradictions effortlessly. Stone does not protest. Walls do not record screams. When the war ended, much of the human cost vanished from view, leaving behind only the physical shell. And physical shells invite interpretation. By the early 1940s, Himmler's ambitions for Wewelsburg had grown more elaborate on paper than in reality. Grand plans envisioned expanded complexes, ceremonial axes, and symbolic alignments that would further cement the castle's status as the SS's ideological center. Most of these plans were never realized. The war demanded resources. Manpower was redirected. The castle remained incomplete. Half vision, half structure. This incompleteness would later prove crucial. Completed monuments declare their purpose clearly. Incomplete ones invite speculation. When Allied forces advanced and the Third Reich collapsed, the SS attempted to erase traces of their project. Parts of the castle were damaged intentionally. Documents were destroyed. Plans were abandoned. There was no dramatic final ritual, no apocalyptic destruction. The end was administrative, hurried, and unceremonious. But the damage was enough. Enough to suggest secrecy. Enough to suggest something unfinished. Enough to suggest that the truth had been interrupted. After the war, investigators and historians were left with fragments. A partially transformed castle. Architectural anomalies. Unanswered questions. Why this tower? Why these designs? Why was so much effort invested here? Into these gaps flowed imagination. Over time, architectural intention was reinterpreted as occult purpose. Atmosphere was mistaken for ritual. Silence was read as secrecy. The deliberate absence of explanation became proof of hidden meaning. This is how places acquire reputations they were never meant to have. The architecture of Wewelsburg did not conceal ancient power. It concealed banality, the banality of bureaucratic evil, of systems that function without passion or doubt. It is easier to believe in a temple of doom than to confront the reality that mass violence can be planned in quiet rooms by men who believe they are acting rationally. Wewelsburg, as a built environment, reveals something deeply unsettling about the Third Reich. Not its fascination with the occult, but its mastery of symbolism stripped of spirituality. What was constructed there was not a gateway to other worlds. It was a closed circuit, a place where ideology fed on itself. And this is why the castle remains disturbing long after the myths are peeled away. Because once the atmosphere is understood, the question changes. Not, what dark forces were summoned here? But, how easily can ordinary spaces be turned into engines of belief? The answer, as Wewelsburg shows, is uncomfortably simple. All it takes is power, patience, and walls willing to listen. Every myth needs an image, something simple enough to be remembered, abstract enough to be interpreted, and ambiguous enough to survive contradiction. For Wewelsburg, that image would come not from a text, not from a ritual, but from the floor of a room. A circular mosaic set into stone. Today, it is almost impossible to separate this symbol from the mythology that surrounds it. It appears in documentaries, on websites, in extremist iconography, and in endless online debates. It is commonly referred to as the Black Sun. But here is the first and most important fact. At the time it was created, it had no such name. There is no surviving SS document that refers to the mosaic as the Black Sun. No speech by Heinrich Himmler describing it as an ancient symbol. No internal explanation of its meaning, ritual use, or supposed power. The symbol existed. The myth did not. The mosaic is located in the upper hall of the North Tower at Wewelsburg Castle. It consists of 12 radial segments arranged around a central point, forming a dark, wheel-like shape against a lighter stone background. Its design is striking, but not unique. Similar geometric patterns can be found across Europe, particularly in medieval and early modern architecture. Wheels, suns, and radial forms appear in churches, palaces, and civic buildings, often without any fixed symbolic meaning beyond balance, order, or decoration. This matters because the later interpretation of the mosaic assumes intentionality far beyond what can be demonstrated. In popular retellings, the symbol is presented as an ancient rune, a lost pagan sunwheel, or a secret emblem of SS cosmology. Entire belief systems have been retroactively constructed around it. But belief does not equal origin. At the time of its installation, the mosaic functioned as part of an architectural environment designed to impress and discipline, not to initiate. Its placement in the North Tower reinforced the atmosphere of gravity and exclusivity. But atmosphere is not doctrine. There were no instructions attached to it, no recorded ceremonies centered around it, no evidence of initiations performed upon it. The silence surrounding the symbol is not proof of secrecy. It is proof of absence. And absence, when combined with fear and fascination, is fertile ground for invention. After the collapse of the Third Reich, Wewelsburg became a site of unanswered questions. The SS had destroyed documents. The castle itself bore traces of unfinished plans. Investigators and historians were left with fragments rather than explanations. Into this void stepped interpretation. In the decades following the war, researchers attempted to understand the SS's internal culture. Given the regime's obsession with myth, race, and symbolism, it was tempting to assume that every unexplained design choice must conceal hidden meaning. The mosaic was irresistible. It was visually powerful. It was unexplained. and it was located at the heart of a site already associated with secrecy. Gradually, hypotheses hardened into assumptions. By the late 20th century, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, the mosaic had acquired a name: Black Sun. The term did not originate with the SS. It emerged from post-war esoteric literature and was later amplified by neo-Nazi and occult circles seeking symbols that felt both ancient and forbidden. Once named, the symbol became portable. Detached from its architectural context, it could be reproduced, stylized, and invested with new meanings. It began to circulate independently of Wewelsburg, appearing in tattoos, flags, and online spaces far removed from its original setting. This portability is a crucial part of the myth's survival. A symbol without a fixed explanation invites projection. Each group can see what it wants to see. For some, it became a sign of racial destiny. For others, evidence of a hidden SS religion. For still others, a cipher pointing toward lost knowledge or supernatural power. None of these interpretations are supported by primary sources. What they are supported by is desire. The desire for secrets, the desire for hidden layers, the desire to believe that history contains doors yet to be opened. The irony is that the SS did not need such symbols to function. Their power came from bureaucracy, violence, and compliance, not from mysticism. The mosaic did not guide policy. It did not justify genocide. It did not determine strategy. Those decisions were made in offices, on paper, through memoranda and meetings. Yet the symbol persists because it offers a different narrative, one that shifts attention away from the banality of evil and towards something darker, more exotic, and ultimately more comforting. If atrocities were driven by occult forces, then they are harder to repeat. If they were driven by ordinary men following ideology, they are not. The transformation of the mosaic into the Black Sun illustrates how history can be reshaped after the fact. Meaning is not discovered. It is assigned. And once assigned, it is difficult to remove. This process accelerated with the rise of visual media. Documentaries framed the symbol with ominous lighting and dramatic narration. Online forums connected it to unrelated artifacts and traditions. Each retelling added another layer of implication. Speculation became repetition. Repetition became familiarity. Familiarity became belief. Crucially, these interpretations often ignored context. The mosaic was never meant to stand alone. It was part of a controlled environment where meaning was reinforced through hierarchy and repetition, not through explanation. Once removed from that environment, it became a Rorschach test. People saw what they brought with them. This is why attempts to debunk the symbol often fail to convince. Debunking assumes that belief is rooted in evidence. In reality, belief here is rooted in identity. For those drawn to the myth of Wewelsburg, the Black Sun is not just a historical curiosity. It is a badge of insider knowledge. To question it is to threaten belonging. And belonging, as Himmler understood, is powerful. The tragedy is that the symbol's afterlife often eclipses the reality of the place where it originated. The forced labor, the ideological conditioning, the human cost of the SS project, all of this fades behind the allure of a supposed ancient sign. The symbol distracts. It invites endless discussion about origins and meanings while diverting attention from consequences. Wewelsburg becomes a puzzle rather than a warning. Yet the truth is more unsettling than any occult fantasy. The mosaic did not need a name to function. It did not need a doctrine to influence behavior. It existed as part of an environment designed to suppress doubt and elevate obedience. Its power was contextual, not mystical. When that context vanished, the symbol was reborn as myth. This rebirth says less about the SS than about those who came after them. About a post-war world struggling to comprehend industrialized violence and searching for explanations that feel proportional to the horror. A dark symbol feels appropriate. A banal explanation does not. But history rarely conforms to emotional expectations. The black sun was not a key to secret knowledge. It was an empty center, one that others filled with meaning long after its creators were gone. And that is the final irony of Wewelsburg's most famous image. It reveals nothing about ancient power, but it reveals a great deal about how myths are born when silence meets imagination. In the next chapter, we will follow that process to its logical conclusion, examining how Wewelsburg itself was transformed after the war from an unfinished ideological project into a global symbol of hidden Nazi evil. Not because of what was done there, but because of what people needed to believe had been done there. By the time the war ended, Wewelsburg was no longer what the SS had intended it to be. It was damaged, partially destroyed, abandoned. But paradoxically, this physical decline marked the beginning of the castle's second life, one far more influential than its first. Because unfinished places invite explanation, and explanation, when mixed with fear and guilt, turns quickly into myth. In the ruins of the Third Reich, Germany faced a problem that no tribunal or archive could fully resolve: how to explain the scale of the crimes that had been committed, the industrialized murder, the bureaucratic precision, the participation of ordinary men. The temptation to reach for something extraordinary was strong. If the crimes were monstrous, then their origin must be monstrous as well. If millions were murdered, then surely something unnatural must have driven it. This is where Wewelsburg became useful again. The castle offered a spatial anchor for abstract horror. It was remote, silent, visually imposing, and already associated, however loosely, with secrecy and symbolism. It could absorb projection without resistance. What had once been an ideological workshop now became a narrative container. And narratives, unlike buildings, travel easily. In the decades following the war, Wewelsburg slowly entered popular consciousness, not as a historical site, but as a question mark. What had happened there? What was planned? What had been hidden? The lack of clear answers did not slow the story down. It accelerated it. In popular culture, absence is rarely treated as uncertainty. It is treated as evidence. Documents destroyed, proof of secrecy, plans unfinished, proof of interruption, silence in the archives, proof that someone is hiding something. This logic is emotionally satisfying, even when it is intellectually fragile. By the late 20th century, especially with the rise of mass media and later the internet, Wewelsburg's image began to detach entirely from its documented history. The castle was no longer a site where ideology had been reinforced. It became a supposed center of dark knowledge. This transformation was not accidental. Myths do not survive because they are true. They survive because they are useful. For extremist groups, Wewelsburg offered something invaluable, a symbol that felt ancient, exclusive, and transgressive. A place that could be framed as forbidden rather than discredited. Open admiration for Nazism was increasingly unacceptable. But coded symbols, obscure references, and esoteric myths offered a way around that stigma. The castle became shorthand. To invoke Wewelsburg was to signal insider status. To reference its symbols was to claim hidden knowledge. To believe in its supposed rituals was to reject mainstream history. In this way, myth functioned as camouflage. The focus shifted away from ideology and toward mystery, away from genocide and toward symbols, away from responsibility and toward speculation. This was not a revival of the SS worldview. It was its mutation. At the same time, popular media played its part, often unintentionally. Documentaries framed Wewelsburg with ominous music and shadowed imagery. Hypotheses were presented alongside facts without clear distinction. Visual language did the work that footnotes could not. A suggestion, repeated often enough, becomes an assumption. A castle shown through darkness becomes sinister by default. A symbol shown without context becomes ancient by implication. The line between investigation and imagination blurred. Importantly, this process did not require malicious intent. Many creators genuinely sought to understand the SS's internal culture. But the tools of television, compression, drama, visual shorthand, rewarded mystery over clarity, and mystery sells. This created a feedback loop. The more Wewelsburg was presented as a place of hidden power, the more audiences expected it to be one. The more they expected it, the more creators framed it that way. Each iteration moved the story further from the historical record. Eventually, the myth became self-sustaining. Online communities amplified this process dramatically. Forums, blogs, and later social media allowed speculation to circulate without friction. Claims were repeated without sources. Images were shared without explanation. Symbols were detached from origin and reattached to fantasy. What began as curiosity hardened into belief. This belief did not remain abstract. Symbols associated with Wewelsburg began to appear in extremist propaganda. The castle's imagery was woven into narratives of racial destiny and hidden continuity. It became a way to suggest that the Nazi project had not ended, only gone underground. This was not accidental nostalgia. It was strategic. Myth offers deniability. A man wearing a swastika is explicit. A man invoking a black sun is ambiguous. Ambiguity allows movements to survive in hostile environments. It allows recruitment without declaration. It allows ideology to pass as curiosity. In this sense, Wewelsburg's post-war myth fulfilled a function its creators never fully realized during the war. It became a weapon, not a weapon of mass destruction, but a weapon of orientation, a way to guide belief, identity, and allegiance without ever stating goals openly. At the same time, the myth also served a different audience. For those repelled by Nazism, but fascinated by evil, Wewelsburg offered a safe distance. The horrors of the regime could be reframed as the result of secret rituals and dark obsessions rather than systemic ideology. This reframing is comforting. If evil is exotic, it is rare. If it is banal, it is repeatable. The myth allows society to externalize responsibility, to believe that what happened in Nazi Germany required something abnormal, a cult, a curse, a hidden religion. But the historical record shows something far more unsettling. What happened did not require temples. It did not require ancient symbols. It required organization, obedience, and belief reinforced by structure. By focusing on Wewelsburg as a supposed temple of doom, attention shifts away from ministries, rail schedules, paperwork, and meetings, the real engines of genocide. Myth becomes distraction. This is why the story of Wewelsburg matters beyond the castle itself. It illustrates how societies process trauma by transforming it into legend. How complexity is simplified into symbolism. How responsibility is displaced onto objects and places. The castle absorbs blame without ever demanding accountability. Yet the myth is not static. Each generation reshapes it to fit new anxieties. In the Cold War, it became a symbol of totalitarian secrecy. In the post-Cold War era, it merged with conspiracy culture. In the digital age, it circulates as aesthetic, stripped even of narrative, reduced to images and vibes. The original context fades further with each iteration. What remains is atmosphere, and atmosphere, once detached from history, is infinitely reusable. This is the final stage of myth-making, when meaning no longer depends on origin at all. When a symbol can be invoked without reference, explanation, or consequence. Wewelsburg reaches this stage not because of what the SS accomplished there, but because of what they left unfinished. An incomplete project invites completion in the imagination. And imagination, unlike architecture, has no constraints. The danger lies not in believing that Wewelsburg was a temple of doom. The danger lies in what that belief replaces. It replaces analysis with awe. It replaces responsibility with mystery. It replaces history with legend. And legends, once accepted, are far harder to dismantle than lies. In the final chapter, we will return to the castle itself, not as a symbol, but as a warning, examining what remains today and what Wewelsburg ultimately teaches us about power, belief, and the human need for meaning in the aftermath of catastrophe. Because the most enduring weapon forged at Wewelsburg was not hidden in stone. It was forged in interpretation. When the Third Reich collapsed, it did not leave behind clarity. It left behind ruins. Some of them were obvious: shattered cities, mass graves, abandoned camps. Others were quieter, places that survived physically but lost their purpose overnight. Wewelsburg was one of them. By the spring of 1945, the castle no longer mattered to those who had once invested it with meaning. The SS retreated. Documents were destroyed. Parts of the complex were deliberately damaged, not in a ritual act, but in a practical one, to prevent reuse. There was no final stand, no sacred destruction, no symbolic ending, just withdrawal. This anticlimax is important because it contradicts nearly every myth that would later surround the site. True centers of belief tend to end dramatically. They are defended, burned, consecrated, or mourned. Wewelsburg was simply abandoned. In the immediate post-war years, it attracted little attention. Germany was overwhelmed with far greater ruins and far more urgent questions. Survival, reconstruction, and accountability pushed obscure castles to the margins of memory. And yet, Wewelsburg did not disappear. Its physical survival created a problem that many other Nazi sites avoided by being destroyed. It remained available for interpretation. What should be done with a place so closely associated with the SS, yet lacking the obvious markers of crime found elsewhere? For years, there was no clear answer. The castle passed through periods of neglect and repurposing. At times, it was treated as little more than a historical curiosity. At others, as an uncomfortable reminder best left unexamined. This hesitation allowed myth to grow unchecked. Without a clear narrative grounded in documentation, Wewelsburg became a vacuum. And vacuums rarely remain empty. By the late 20th century, the castle had begun to attract attention again, not from historians alone, but from those searching for something else. Something hidden, something forbidden. The same qualities that had once made it useful to the SS, isolation, silence, incompleteness, now made it attractive to mythmakers. The site was no longer controlled by ideology, but by imagination. As interest grew, so did the need for an official response. Wewelsburg could not simply be ignored forever. Leaving it undefined meant surrendering it to the loudest voices, often those with the least concern for historical accuracy. Eventually, the decision was made to contextualize, rather than conceal. The castle was transformed into a museum and memorial space. Exhibitions focused not on mysticism, but on structure, not on symbols, but on systems. The role of the SS was documented through administration, hierarchy, and violence rather than myth. This was a deliberate choice. To explain Wewelsburg honestly required resisting the temptation to sensationalize it. It required acknowledging that the site's power lay not in occult forces, but in how efficiently ideology could be embedded in ordinary environments. For some visitors, this approach was disappointing. There was no hidden chamber, no secret artifact, no final revelation. Just files, testimonies, and context. But disappointment in this case is instructive. It reveals how deeply the myth had taken root, how strongly people wanted Wewelsburg to be something extraordinary, because the alternative is harder to accept. That ordinary places can become extraordinary engines of harm. The museum's quietness is its strongest statement. It strips away atmosphere and replaces it with explanation. It refuses to indulge fantasy, and in doing so, it exposes the final illusion at the heart of the Wewelsburg myth. That evil must look dramatic. In reality, the SS did not need temples to function. They needed offices, chains of command, and men willing to obey. Wewelsburg's real lesson lies here. The castle did not produce violence through ritual. It normalized violence through structure. It reinforced identity through exclusion. It taught obedience through repetition and silence. These mechanisms are not relics of the past. They appear wherever power goes unchallenged and belief replaces scrutiny. This is why the post-war myth of Wewelsburg is not harmless folklore. It shapes how societies understand responsibility. By framing Nazi crimes as the product of dark obsession or secret religion, it subtly removes them from the realm of the ordinary. And that is dangerous. Because if atrocity requires a temple of doom, then modern societies can reassure themselves, we have no such places. Therefore, we are safe. But history suggests otherwise. Atrocities are rarely born in temples. They are born in offices, in meeting rooms, in systems that reward conformity and punish doubt. Wewelsburg survived because it was not essential. It was symbolic, not operational. The SS could collapse without it. But symbols, once released into the world, rarely die. Today, the castle exists in multiple forms at once. It is a museum, a memorial, a historical site, and for some a symbol divorced entirely from its origins. This coexistence is uncomfortable, but honest. It reflects the layered nature of memory itself. Wewelsburg cannot be reduced to a single meaning, because it was never just one thing. It was an ordinary castle, then an ideological stage, then a ruin, then a myth, then a warning. The danger lies in stopping at myth. When Wewelsburg is treated solely as a temple of doom, it becomes exotic, remote, safe to observe from a distance. When it is understood as a tool of belief-making, it becomes uncomfortably relevant. Because the techniques used there, ritualized identity, controlled environments, selective history, did not vanish in 1945. They adapt, they resurface, not always with uniforms, not always with flags, often without obvious symbols at all. This is the real legacy of Wewelsburg, not a hidden artifact, not an ancient sun, but a demonstration of how easily meaning can be engineered, and how difficult it is to dismantle once it takes hold. The castle still stands, not as a temple, but as a reminder that the most dangerous myths are not the ones carved in stone, but the ones we choose to believe because they make reality easier to bear. In the early 2000s, Wewelsburg returned to public attention not through archives or newly discovered documents, but through television. Documentary filmmakers, including those working for National Geographic, explored the internal world of the SS, its symbolism, and its obsession with myth. Wewelsburg appeared on screen as a place of speculation, not proof. Questions were raised, possibilities suggested. But television has its own language. Hypotheses were paired with ominous visuals. Silence became mystery. Atmosphere became implication. What was presented as theory was remembered as fact. Over time, fragments of these documentaries were detached from their original context. Titles changed. Narration disappeared. Speculation hardened into certainty. The internet did the rest. What had once been framed as some believe became it was proven. What had been discussed as possibility became memory. Yet no archives revealed a hidden SS religion. No documents confirmed a temple of doom. No evidence ever surfaced of ancient artifacts or secret rituals. What survived was not truth, but a story. And stories, once powerful enough, no longer need evidence to endure. Wewelsburg was never a temple of dark forces. It was something far more dangerous. A place where myth was manufactured deliberately and later recycled unconsciously. The castle still stands, not as proof of occult power, but as proof of how easily belief can outlive facts.